Hello and welcome to a City Voices interview with Sera Davidow. Did I pronounce that right?
Close. Davidow. I think the name David plus Ow.
Okay, so Sera Davidow, who is a mental health activist and writer of many articles, many strong opinions on many topics related to mental health. And so here we are. Hi, Sera.
Hi, thank you for having me here.
My pleasure. So, Sera, what was your life like as a kid in your family?
Oh gosh. Starting with a big question. I think in some ways I grew up with a lot of privilege. I grew up in Greenwich, Connecticut, and I'm white, and so I benefited from all of that. And my family comes from some money, as you might be able to guess from being in Greenwich. But my father left when I was pretty young, and I lived with my brother and my mother, and there was a lot of, I think, abuse, a mix of abuse and neglect in that household. And so it was pretty challenging to kind of get a sense of this world and my safety in it. I remember thinking a lot about how do I fit into this world? How do I connect with people? It all feels hard. I'm not sure how much detail you want me to go into.
Well, my next question is, do you openly talk about the traumas you experienced growing up?
I do. I pretty openly identify as a survivor of physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, some of which happened, a lot of which happened within my household, some of which happened, the sexual abuse piece was neighborhood people, and then others as I got older, wasn't so much happening in my house itself, but I talk about all of that pretty commonly as a part of my story.
Okay. Can you name some happy moments from childhood?
Sure. I spent a lot of time by myself, and that's honestly when I felt the safest, because other people I found to be pretty unpredictable. They were either leaving me or hurting me in some way. And so when I was on my own, I often felt safest and happiest. And where I lived, there was a fair amount of access to nature. And so I found myself doing things like connecting with yellow jackets. I know that sounds weird, but that's what comes to mind. I learned that yellow jackets like potato chips, and so I would just sit very still with potato chips, little broken up pieces of potato chips in my hand, and watch them as they flew down onto my hand and took those away. And things like that, rescuing frogs from the pool and putting them in the pond, those sorts of things are the happy moments in my childhood that I remember most.
Thank you for sharing that. I can picture you as an elf in the woods or something like that. Um, what and who are your biggest influences?
I always find that question tough. It's sort of similar to when people ask me, who are your heroes per se? And I don't really, I guess I think more of moments and tapestries of experiences than I do of particular people. But I think that there's certainly a lot of people in this work and in this world that I admire. Just trying to think of I guess the people, it isn't naming of a specific person, but the people who really always I look to the most are people who seem to approach work in this movement or their lives in a way that doesn't seem to be about fear. And I so appreciate people who know what their values are and are willing to be brave in moments where speaking to their values might be hard and might lose them something. I remember interviewing, I wouldn't say this is a person I necessarily admire, but actually it was a psychologist I remember interviewing for a film I was working on with a coworker in England. We've had some really lucky moments where we've gotten to travel. And I remember him saying, I asked him a question as a part of this interview on film. I asked him, have you lost opportunities for the views that you have about alternatives in the mental health world. And what he said always has stuck with me. He said, not any opportunities I want to have. I appreciate that. Basically the message being, hey, if they're going to cut me out because I'm coming with a different perspective, I'm coming with an alternative, then why would I want to be a part of that? And that's the sort of thing that the sort of quote, I guess, that really sticks with me. Those are the sorts of things that float around my head when I'm feeling afraid or worried about what's going to happen if I make the choice that I feel is the right choice to make.
So you have a lot of respect and admiration for people who challenge the status quo with their views and their practice and their behavior and their way of living. With the possible risk of being like exiled or excommunicated or losing a profession. Or what about people who have risked their lives for what they believe in? Are there any I guess the word is martyrs that you respect?
It's a tough question because I also am very aware that some of the people who are able to take those risks are people who have some privilege. They have something to fall back on if they take that risk. If they lose that career, it's not, they don't end up on the street with nothing, and they don't have kids who get hurt and things like that. So I think that, I want to always hold that piece too. But certainly there are people who put themselves in harm's way, like real harm's way. And I guess, I guess I feel cautious about the sort of martyr approach, because I know sometimes I feel like people expect me to risk anything, everything, and speak up no matter what the loss or consequence might be for me or my family. And sometimes I've actually had to say, like, I can't go quite that far because, I deserve to have some sort of life too. So I try to watch that. But I don't know if I'm really answering your question exactly, Dan. I do think that there's a risk in creating the expectation of martyrdom. I think there's a risk there. And I think sometimes this movement and this work can ask people to just expend everything they have of their soul, their spirit, their energy, and leave them with nothing. And I want to try and support the seeking of balance.
What is the best thing that Caucasian people can do to help our BIPOC fellow human beings to achieve equity in the world?
I mean, that's a huge question. One thing, I don't know, just in terms of language, the language of Caucasian is so interesting. It's actually coming from a period in our history where other words were being used that have since been discarded, and somehow we've hung on to this term Caucasian instead of saying white. So that's just sort of an interesting side point that I think about when I hear that language. I tend to use the language of whiteness. I think that the most important thing we can do just in general is to be willing to measure our privilege against the risks we're taking and make sure that those risks actually measure up to the privilege. So, I see sometimes people say, well, I'm willing to interrupt, or I'm willing to get involved up until it means risking a relationship or risking speaking up in a job and getting in trouble and things like that. And I think that there's no one act people can do and say, well, I've done my anti-racist work and I can be done and I can move on. I think it has to be a constant measuring of the privilege we hold with the risks we're taking all the time. And I think if people can keep that in mind, that guides things that we do.
How do you think men should treat women?
I think certainly sexism and misogyny are pretty rampant issues, pretty big issues of systemic oppression. And I don't know that there's any one answer to that, though. I think that men and women need to be willing to constantly examine the gendered roles that we have been told that we should hold, and be willing to break that down, including breaking down the binary of gender, of just man and just woman. Is, how do we exist as people who can look at each other's strengths, support each other's strengths, support each other to break out of boxes and challenge the norms. I think that that's the biggest piece that I would say. And of course, if you look in the psychiatric survivor movement or any variety of those movements, we can look back to times when, and actually currently as well, when psychiatric diagnosis was used to control women, used to control Black and brown people. And I think that certainly white men in particular have played a big role historically in reinforcing that. So it used to be that man could have his wife put in a psychiatric facility for not agreeing on religion, not agreeing on child rearing. And so we've come a long way from that. But I think, we all participate still in putting people into boxes of what's expected of them. And I think I think we need everyone to participate in undoing that.
How do you think women should treat men?
I guess my answer is similar. I think that the sexism that is rampant in this country it impacts us all, and we all play a role in it. And so for us to change things fundamentally, we all need to play a role in challenging what the norms are, what the expectations are, making space for men to show emotion. It's like we all have a role to play in that. And I think that, in a perfect world, if we ever get there, which we, probably won't, then how men treat women and how women treat men and how people of any gender treat people of any gender comes down to making space for all of us to be who we are and challenge the rules that are put upon us and find our truths.
What are your specific criticisms of the psychiatric industry and its practices?
Oh, that's a long list. So I think a lot of what I've already been talking about, what I would talk about in response to criticisms to the psychiatric industry, is again about putting people in boxes. I think that the psychiatric industry has become all about putting people in boxes, and a lot of it is driven by capitalism as well. So putting people in boxes that include psychiatric labels so that they can have treatments and psychiatric drugs marketed to them, and with very little regard to what happens afterward. Do they actually heal, or are they just controlled? I think that the psychiatric system and psychiatry in general has been used for many, many years to control people. And while I also believe that there are very much people in the psychiatric system who got into it to help to provide people with the supports they need to access a full life, I don't think that's in its design. And so it makes it very hard for those folks who get in there for that reason, which is probably most people who work in that industry. It makes it very hard for them to sustain and actually carry out that goal. I think that we also don't always talk about the real purpose of the design of, say, the state mental health systems. I think many people, if you ask them what's the purpose of a state mental health system, they would say something about supporting people who are struggling. But actually, even people working in those state mental health systems will often say, if you ask them, well, we're supposed to help people, but we're also supposed to protect society. And I think society wants the easiest answer to what will protect them possible. So when something something bad happens, people want to say, well, it was because someone had a psychiatric diagnosis or they were quote unquote mentally ill, and the answer is to control them better. They don't want the real answers, which are often much more complicated and take a lot more time and energy to address, like being the level of houselessness, the food insecurity, the income disparities, the awful things that are happening to people, child abuse, all those things that actually would need to be addressed to better prevent some of the terrible things that happen. People don't want to hear those answers. They just want someone to come along and say, well, this person had this diagnosis, now we'll put them on these psychiatric drugs and that will help. And the research is again and again telling us, like, actually put someone in a psychiatric facility and at least if you step back and look at the bigger picture, their suicide risk seems to go up. Put people on psychiatric drugs long term. Well, I'm not going to say that some people aren't helped. Certainly some people say that they're helped, but big picture suggests that some of those risks of violence may actually increase. And I think some of it comes down to loss of power. And I guess maybe that's the bottom line here. The putting in boxes itself is a loss of power. Someone telling me what is wrong with me, giving me a diagnosis and telling me what I therefore need to do about it is a profound loss of power. And what we see from the adverse childhood experiences study and so much other research is losses of power are cumulative and they lead to bad outcomes for all of us, for individuals and for society as a whole. And as best as I've been able to discern, these mental health systems, these psychiatric systems are designed around losses of power. When do we take your power away?
Do you believe mental illnesses are real conditions that require treatment?
I believe that mental illness is honestly a really awful term that has been used to oppress us and medicalize distress. Now, does that mean I do not believe that there's anything ever biologic going on inside someone that might contribute to extreme levels of distress? No, I do believe that's possible. I think it's probably likely. Do I think that that's the answer for all the people who get told they have a mental illness? Absolutely not. I think it's a dramatic oversimplification of what is actually going on for people, and it's a one-size-fits-all answer for something that actually has many, many answers. And again, when someone gets told that, when they get given that message, when they are told what their distress means, rather than engaging them in a process of exploring what that distress means for themselves, that's a profound loss of power. And I have not seen any benefit from the hypermedicalization of these experiences. Now, I think, if we step back and we looked at, take 1,000 of us who've been given these diagnoses, do some of us have some biologic component going on? Probably. Do some of us have some sort of trauma root to what we've got going on? I think probably most of us. And then there's a little more of a complicated idea in the middle, which is, I do believe that I was born differently. I do believe I had some sensitivities coming into this world. I don't think those are diseases, but I do think that they made me more sensitive to the impact of trauma, and that shows up in how I interact with the world. And I think there's probably a lot of us who are that way, but that's not fundamentally a disease or an illness. I think of Eleanor Longden. We had her over from the United Kingdom, and she's a voice here, and she gives talks, and very popular TED Talk if you look her up that way. And she always is getting this question of, is hearing voices medically rooted? Is it a mental illness? And what she said is, there's a huge difference between saying, especially when you're looking at genetics, for example, if someone hears voices and their child hears voices, does that mean it's an illness that got passed down? Or could it just mean that hearing voices itself might have a relationship in families? And so might someone inherit the experience of hearing voices? Possibly, but does that make it an illness? Not necessarily. And I really appreciated hearing her pull that apart. It is our assumption of what hearing voices means that turns it into this illness frame, but it could simply be just a difference between us. And I also think of Crazy Wise. I was just talking to someone earlier about the film Crazy Wise, where you hear Gogo Akaya Asama, for example, talking about the experience of hearing voices. And she said, when society responded to me as if my hearing voices and all the other experiences I was having were an illness, they medicated me, they hospitalized me, and I got worse. When I connected with my ancestral roots, and she has done a lot of exploration into her ancestral roots, when she was able to connect with those ancestral roots and take a different frame of what those same experiences meant, she was able to develop a full life. She works as in peer support world now. She's been in a film, she's given keynotes, and her life is completely transformed. And it's not because the experience is different, but the framework is different. And because the framework is different, society responds differently to her. And that can be the difference between what is an illness and what is an experience.
How should distressing mental health challenges be treated?
I don't think there's any one answer to that. I think some of it's about how it's impacting that person and whose distress is it. When we do training, sometimes we'll talk about, okay, what about the person who believes something that you think is really wild? They believe, for example, aliens are transmitting the ideas for their art and painting through their fingers, and the beautiful art piece they made is a transmission through aliens. Now, a lot of people will say, like, oh, that's a part of a mental illness, clearly, and that person probably needs treatment. And I think what we need to start doing is asking why. Why does someone need treatment? Who's it bothering? Is it bothering the person who heard the story and doesn't understand it, or is it bothering that person? Now, I know someone who has that life experience, and he's not bothered by it. In fact, he's enjoys the process of his art making, and he sells his art, and he's been quite successful with that. So I think we need to start with whose distress is it? And then, if in fact that person is distressed themselves, are they distressed because it's actually distressing them, or because of how society is responding to that? In which case, that might guide like a process such as what Gogo Akaya went through. Does that person need to be connected to other people that they have commonalities with, who recognize the experience they're having as something not necessarily distressing? And would that be the right support? Or is it coming from a historical trauma? Do they need to or want to work through something that happened to them? Is the voice or whatever they're going through, the suicidal thoughts, are they carrying a meaning that actually the exploration of that meaning will be part of what's healing to them? Do they want some sort of medical intervention? Even if it's not rooted in a medical problem, sometimes psychiatric drugs provide people relief because it might numb something, or it might allow them to stop thinking about something. There's so many different ways to approach these things. For me, what I needed much more, I don't like therapy. Therapy is not helpful. I haven't done well on psychiatric drugs, but I have done well in writing about my experiences and turning my experiences into something that have meaning and can be shared with others. I've found the most healing in that. I also found healing in having a child, very unplanned, but who needed me to get up and feed him every morning, just having something legitimate, like a real purpose and need in the world. There's so many different things that can support people. And for many people, those aren't going to be found either at all or in part in what a doctor is going to tell you or a therapist is going to tell you.
Sera, if you created a mental health system, how do you view the role of pharmaceutical companies in the treatment of people who are experiencing distress from mental health challenges?
So, I wouldn't necessarily erase pharmaceutical companies, but I would hope to erase the profit, because anytime there's such a profit involved, I just don't think it's going to happen that people will follow an ethical code that aligns with what people actually need. So I would want to design a system where there is not the kind of profit involved as there is now. I mean, the lobbying industry for pharmaceutical industry is the biggest lobbying industry, the most expensive lobbying industry in this country, period. And that's not because they're trying to do good for people. It's because they're trying to keep making money. So if we could erase that, I think that would be a start. Now, I also really appreciate, I think there's a big debate between people who think there should be no psych drugs, period, and people who think that there should, but they need to be used carefully. I tend to fall on the used carefully side, but I appreciate the arguments of people who say, yeah, I get it works for some people, but is there a society that could be created that uses that tool ethically? And many people will argue, no, there is not. And I do think that that's really worthy of deep consideration, because I tend to agree that it's pretty tough to design that society where it's used ethically. But I think from there, if psych drugs are going to be available, what I would want is for doctors to be de-elevated, de-platformed. They hold a piece of knowledge. We hold a piece of knowledge. Lots of people hold a piece of knowledge. I think of open dialogue systems in Finland, where you might see a psychiatrist in the room, but he is not, unlike the US, he is not the one who declares the final answer. He just is a part of the conversation and offers what he knows, or, what information he has to bring. And people would be open to, I have a colleague who periodically has used something like Risperdal, but only for like 2 weeks. Just to shut something down, not as an ongoing tool. That's not generally a consideration most doctors in the society would have, though. But in the system that I would design, there'd be that flexibility. And I also look back to open dialogue systems where it's not where they start. Pills are not generally where they start, or if they do, it's for very short time use of something like sleeping medication, because a lot of people's distress is rooted in dysregulation of sleeping and food and other kinds of balance. And so might someone first try a sleeping pill for a week and see if that might help them where they want to go. So I would create much more space for exploration and much more space for divorcing psychiatric drugs from an assumed meaning. So like I said earlier, even if I was taking a pill every day, that doesn't necessarily mean the root of my distress is medical. I could recognize that, hey, people have been using chemicals in their bodies since the beginning of time and will continue to do so. And this particular chemical helps me feel the way I want to feel right now. It doesn't necessarily define who I am or the meaning of my distress. And so there'd be space for that, because, our system says, you have bipolar and therefore you need this medication to treat it, when the scientific knowledge isn't actually there. And I think we need to stop with that level of dishonesty of pretending we know and accept that we don't know and make lots of space for exploration.
For this next question, there are bits and pieces of previous answers you provided that could be pieced together to answer this, but let's hear you answer it all at once. If someone you knew were experiencing very distressing mental health challenges, what steps would you recommend they take to address it?
It's hard to answer that without having a particular scenario. What is it? Is it, is it suicide? Is it, I think, but I'll do my best with this. I think that first, again, I would want to explore with them who is distressed by this, because sometimes people will show up in a community and say, I'm distressed by this, but what they really mean is their family is really distressed by this, and if they could just be left alone or given some different support, it's actually an experience that they're not as distressed by as the people around them. Or perhaps their distress is coming from the fact that people are threatening to put them in a psychiatric facility against their will. Because,
well, in this scenario, the distress is genuinely your friends. They are distressed.
Okay. So if that person, in fact, is distressed themselves, then I think I would want to start just by hearing them, hearing what is going on for them, if they're able to speak, if they're not able to speak, which is certainly, I know, a place I've gotten to and others have gotten to. I would want to just spend time with them and make sure that they know that they're not alone. When they are able to speak, I would want to look for the questions that rarely get asked, if they're open to questions, and explore with them, what have they done in the past when they've been in this space, if that's happened, and what has worked. I would want to think about, if they're saying, well, I'm distressed and therefore I go to the hospital, I wouldn't stop them from going to the hospital, but I would want to make sure to have a conversation with them about what are they looking for if they go to the hospital, because very few people get asked that. And sometimes people have answers that don't align with what the hospital is actually going to offer. They want to get some sleep or be left alone. That's probably not going to happen in the hospital. So, let's talk about that. Is what you want actually in that space, or are there other spaces we could explore? I know one of my coworkers once asked someone who was saying they wanted to go to the hospital, like, well, are there other places that bring you peace? And that person said, yes, I really find that I'm at peace in nature by waterfalls. And my coworker had an app that told her where the nearest waterfall was, and they went and sat in that space. And at the end of that, that person felt less distressed and didn't end up going to the hospital. In another situation I can think of where someone was very distressed in probably a way that would have landed them in the hospital had they intersected with a number of people. What they really needed was some sleep and some food. So exploring, what's happening for someone, what are they missing, what are they wanting, would be my starting point. If they did want to go somewhere like that was, somewhere they were going to stay, is that a hospital? Is it a pure respite? What is available to them? And then how do they, can I support them to put in protection? Say they're going to a hospital, can I help them think about what would protect them from the parts of the hospital that could hurt, and maximize what they're actually trying to access if they are to go to that environment? But a lot of the time, the majority of the time, in my experience, when someone is really distressed, what they're looking for is to not feel alone, to feel like people are hearing them. We talk in a lot of our trainings about VC, which stands for validation, curiosity, vulnerability, and community. And those are the words I often keep in my mind when I'm trying to support someone in distress. And that requires me to make sure they know I see and hear them, that I'm willing to explore with them what makes sense for where we go from here, that I share some of myself, and that we talk about or connect with things in the community that will help them feel grounded.
Thank you. Thank you for saying all of that. What is your opinion on NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness?
Controversial question. So I think that there are lots of good people working within the National Alliance for Mental Illness, whether it's national or particularly in its chapters. And I think that there's many desperate parents who go there for lack of anywhere else to go, who are not bad people and desperately want to help their children, both under 18 and over. And I think NAMI itself is tremendously problematic. It takes a ton of pharmaceutical money. Pharmaceutical industry professionals have been very clear that organizations like NAMI are their best advertisements. They've actually said that in writing. The commercials we can do, we have to list all the nasty negative effects of our psych drugs, but NAMI and places like NAMI, they do the work for us. So I think that's hugely problematic. NAMI National tends to be pro-force, and many chapters are either neutral or pro-force themselves. That's changed somewhat. And I guess the other problem is that they take up so much of the space. I just was talking to someone a couple of days ago who said, oh yeah, there was this workshop going on and the only person they reached out, or the only group they reached out to, was NAMI. Why? Because NAMI is what so many people know to reach out to. And so that means that message that they have that often is medicalized, includes false statements and bad science, like mental illness is just like diabetes. I mean, those are marketing terms. I think it's hugely problematic. And unfortunately, even when you get to the best chapters of NAMI, and there are some ones doing really good work, they are unfortunately serving so the national NAMI can say like, well, look, we're not against peer support. We have people in NAMI doing peer support over here, or, we're not all about psych drugs, look over in this corner, you can see us doing this work over here. And so even the NAMI chapters that are doing the best work are still serving to increase the visibility of NAMI National. And I think that's hugely problematic. And we are in desperate need of alternatives that are not beholden to the pharmaceutical industry, that are not promoting fake science, and that give people more options and more frameworks for how to see their own experiences and the experiences of their loved ones.
What are your thoughts on the peer support in psychiatric survivors' civil rights movements?
Again, a big question. I think are a number of overlapping movements that are within that scope of the question that you're asking me. And I think that unfortunately, peer support is fairly co-opted. It's really hard to get funding and offer peer support and stay true to the integrity of peer support rules. It has become an industry, and it's an industry, if you go to the big industry conferences, where you're going to hear a lot of the conventional clinical speak and ways of doing things and ways of believing we should be responding to things echoed. And I think that behind me, I don't know if you can see, but behind me, there are some framed magazines, and they are like Madness Network news magazines and things like that. And the level of advocacy and activism and voice that they had is not something we see as commonly today. We don't see as many loud, effective protests and pushbacks. And I unfortunately think that it's the peer support industry, at least in part, that has taken out some of the fire from that activism. Because when you become dependent on the system you are trying to change for your money, for your livelihood, it's really hard to be as loud. And so I think that's a real problem. And there's still lots of great things happening in the peer support world. And I think particularly in the psychiatric survivor world, there still are some louder voices, and I so appreciate them. And I appreciate the people who are invested in making sure that real alternatives happen. I feel like we're constantly in a battle to maintain the integrity of the different types of supports we offer. And even right now in a neighboring state, they just released a request for proposals to fund the first peer respite in that state. And it's a train wreck. It's an absolute train wreck. It's a completely co-opted, clinicalized, not really deserving to be called peer respite. And if that in fact happens, if it gets funded, I feel sometimes like I'm watching all the work of the psychiatric survivors from those magazines behind me and all the things that they fought for be chipped away at. And I'm not always quite sure how to protect it, but I'm trying. And I know there's other people out there trying.
What are some resources or support that should be more readily available to individuals who have survived the psychiatric system?
Well, I think peer respite should be more available, but I don't think that's an answer. Sometimes people think, oh, we'll fund this one single alternative and we'll drop it into this area and then everything will be great. And it doesn't work because A, it's not enough of that one alternative, and B, that one alternative is not the only answer. So there's peer respite, there's soteria. I think that I think open dialogue is going to be incredibly difficult to do well in this country because of all our healthcare and liability approaches. But I think that is another piece of the puzzle of creating real alternatives. I think the Hearing Voices Network being properly funded. I think approaches like Alternatives to Suicide, which my own organization developed, where we aren't constantly just trying to control people. I think any approach that is rooted in harm reduction, that's really what it is. Harm reduction is conventionally understood within the scope of substance use, and it's not very well understood even at that. But if you really look at what harm reduction is about, it is about giving up the power to tell someone else what their problem is and why that problem exists, and supporting them to explore how to live a full life, even if that problem is going to continue, even if they want, whether or not they want support to change what has been defined as the problem. So people getting to live full lives and make their own meaning and identify their own problems is really at the root of harm reduction. And Alternatives to Suicide, peer respite when it's done well, Hearing Voices, open dialogue, all of those center around that harm reduction fundamental value. And I think that that's really where I hope that we can head.
Do people who experience serious mental health challenges have anything to be ashamed of?
No, I think that people who are struggling are often struggling within the context of a world where it makes sense that people are struggling. It doesn't make any sense at all to say that, because you are responding to these terrible things in the way that you are, that you should be ashamed, or even when no one can point to something that someone's responding to. They are who they are. They're unique. There's strengths and there's challenges that we're all facing, and none of that has to be shameful. I think what would be shameful is if we constructed a society where only the people who didn't have those struggles had space to be and live full lives, because it's often that society that's created those struggles. And so, I think that would be shameful. I think the way our society is designed is in alignment with that in a lot of ways. And I think that is shameful, but that's not about the individuals who are struggling themselves.
Now, this is our last question, and it piggybacks right off the last statement you made. What changes need to be made on a societal level before people with serious mental health challenges can be embraced by the rest of humanity?
Well, I think that in some ways, if we look back at, certainly there's never been a period in time where there are not serious issues with racism and other forms of oppression. Absolutely. But there have been times in history when communities were closer knit and there was more space for someone struggling to still just be held by that community and find a place in that community. And I think that I guess what I'm struggling with is, how do we get back to a place where there's not just like the one person who comes in who knows the strategies to support someone well, because that's not sustainable. There's not enough of us and it gets exhausting. But how do we create in our communities the kind of container that I think there has been at times, a kind of close-knitness without giving up some of the technological advances that we also have? How do we do that? And how do we also prioritize people having their basic needs met? I mean, that is an absolutely critical change. We live in a society where people consider it to be a privilege or a sign of success and hard work if you have a place to live and you have enough to eat, those sorts of things. I don't know how we work on emotional balance and well-being when we're constantly, having people on the streets barely surviving and not knowing if their basic needs are going to be met. I mean, there's so many other pieces to that question that you're asking, but I think that starting with people's basic needs met and creating a society that feels responsible to one another. I think right now we are in a society where the mental health system is seen as responsible for certain people, which means, again, they're taking power over and away from those people. But if we can find a way to convince people that we need to be responsible to one another, all of us, then I think that's the big shift.
Do you think we'll get there? Do you think humanity will survive in the next 200 years and or evolve into a society that you hope for?
No, I wish I could say yes. I mean, I think we may survive, but I don't think it's really hard to imagine. I am not going to label myself as anti-capitalist or anything. I think all systems and ways of being together have their issues, but the drive of capitalism to sort of get yours as if there's not enough to go around, I don't see that going away anytime soon. And I don't know how we achieve what I'm talking about with that in mind. There's too many people who hold too much power who are saying, nope, nope, I just want more. I want more. And there has to be someone who pays for that, right? They have to be the people who are failing where I'm succeeding. And I'm not sure how we change that way of being enough to get there. I'd like to believe that, at some point, it will, the things going on with the earth and so on, are more people will become aware of some of those challenges and take a step back and be willing to be less greedy and less self-focused. But I have my fears that we won't get there. I think in order to make those fundamental changes, there needs to be a fundamental shift in what people see as being important and priority. And I haven't seen that shift for the most part.
What do you hope to accomplish, Sera Davidow, before you die?
Oh gosh, I hope to see my own children grow up fully. One's 20 and one's 11. Grow up fully and be bringing some of these similar values and approaches into the world. I hope to see some shift happening. I hope to be able to share the knowledge that I and many of the other people that I have the privilege of working with. I hope that some of the ideas that we have will somehow find their way to be more commonplace, that the idea of talking about harm reduction approaches will no longer be shocking, that the idea that the loss of power is, just the power of loss of power is profound, and that we start looking at things from that direction rather than constantly medicalizing. I hope I can see some headway on those things, and that I'll have been a part of that through training and writing and talking, having conversations like this with people. And I just, I also, again, in the name of balance and not being a martyr to any particular thing, I also hope to find more of my own peace. I think that the constant ingesting of anger and injustice is hard. And that's what I've been doing for a lot of years. So I hope to get there, to a place of, knowing that these injustices are still happening and not letting that go, but also finding more places of peace for myself.
Do you have any final thoughts for our small audience?
I just hope that people who are listening will really grab a hold of that idea of the importance of paying attention to loss of power. I think that's one of the things I talk more and more about, and that more of those conversations will start to happen everywhere.